South Africa abstained from endorsing a United Nations resolution condemning Russia's aggression in Ukraine. The majority of UN General Assembly member states voted yesterday to reprimand Russia. South Africa was one of 35 countries that abstained. For more on this, we're joined by Associate Professor of Public Law at the University of Cape Town. That's Professor Richard Calland. Professor, always good to see you. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. You penned a very interesting opinion piece. We'll get into that in a few moments. But on this matter of South Africa abstaining from voting, of what consequence or significance would it have been, given that we do not have a permanent seat? Russia does and can veto any decision.
Well, that's right, Dudu, and thank you for having me on. It's a delicate matter. It's very complex. There are no clear binary yes, no, right, wrong answers here. I think we're dealing with shades of grey. South Africa is trying to preserve its long-held position of essentially neutrality, of non-alignment. It's conscious of the fact that there is a breach of sovereignty here, a breach of international law, but it believes wholeheartedly that political dialogue is the way forward. And the reason I believe it abstained yesterday is because, as the explanatory memo later said, it felt that the resolution that was before the General Assembly, which is frankly just a piece of paper, it's symbolic rather than having any real legal or political impact, that statement was more likely to do harm than good in terms of pushing Putin into a corner. So the South African position is governed and driven, I think, by realpolitik and by a pragmatic desire to do what's most effective rather than to grandstand. Now, we can debate whether that's the right thing to do, morally, ethically, and no doubt we will.
I'd like for us maybe to get into your article, right? And maybe let's start with this recollection that you make and this case study that you use of some 20 years ago when Fink Haseman went to Zimbabwe to assess the situation there. A quick introduction of that and whether that yielded any result.
Well, that's right. It's an interesting one. It sprung to my mind this week as I was contemplating and wrestling with this difficult position or choice that South Africa had to take in relation to the UN resolution. And I remember I happened to be in London and Fink Haseman called me because he was looking on behalf of the Dutch government for a partner in Southern Africa to work with the Zimbabweans who were going through their first real crisis of the Mugabe era. And I worked for Adasa at the time. Now, Fink, who was Nelson Mandela's legal advisor in the presidency, was by now a freelance, independent international consultant and conflict resolver. And the Dutch government wanted him to go to Zimbabwe and assess the situation there and to determine a very straightforward but difficult question, which was, should the Dutch government take a side? Should it move away from its stated position of non-partisanship? And Fink's answer was yes, the conditions on the ground were now so bad and the human rights violations so serious that in fact international organizations or governments such as the Dutch should support the movement for democratic change, the MDC, the opposition. That was the position they took. Did it do any good? No, because Mugabe stayed in power for another 15 years. It didn't perhaps advance the cause of dialogue and peace building, but it was the right thing to do, arguably. And on a normative, moral basis, it established a principle of being on the right side of history at the right time. And that, of course, is an issue that now arises in the Ukraine matter. What is history telling us? What, in future, looking back at this incident, what will our children and grandchildren have expected from us in terms of taking a stand and doing something that is effective in the face of this violence and this war?
On that issue of Zimbabwe, to my recollection at least, the West was very vocal against the Mugabe regime. In this particular instance with the latest conflict, it would appear, according to a widely held view in some sectors of society, that what's good for the goose is clearly not good for the gander, because the West has not expressed the same outrage, for instance, against, the Israeli international war, or not war, that's the wrong word, the Israel-Palestine issue, if you will. Your thought on that?
Well, it's a very important comparison that you bring to bear, because I think what informs the South African position, and indeed the position of non-aligned countries, and probably many of those 35 countries that abstained yesterday on the UN General Assembly resolution, was exactly this: the inconsistency of approach, and indeed the hypocrisy of many Western countries who take a stand when their interests are directly threatened, as they are now in the case of the Ukraine crisis, but on issues such as Palestine, refuse to take a stand and refuse to stand up to Israeli incursions of Palestinian protected land and breaches of international law, and indeed the violence that is perpetrated, the human rights violations that are perpetrated on the Palestinian people. So it's that inconsistency, that hypocrisy, which I think sticks in the craw of countries of the global south. And I think it's a mistake of Western countries and NATO countries to think that South Africa should automatically fall into line in terms of their positioning in relation to Ukraine. That's a grave misunderstanding of geopolitics, it seems to me, as well as the history of the ANC and the history of South Africa. But having said that, Tutu, one thing that concerns me is this, that South Africa has always stood up for sovereignty. It's always stood up it's always stood against regime change. Now, it's clear to me, as I think it is to many people, that Putin's primary goal here is not necessarily to take control in terms of territory of the Ukraine, but he wants regime change. He wants a government there that will be a puppet government, that will be a buffer between him and the West, and which will abandon all hopes of joining the European Union or even NATO. Now, South Africa, it seems to me, should take a stand against that kind of breach of international law and indeed that regime change ambition of Putin. That would be consistent with South Africa's previous positions, but they say, the officials in Durban say, well, context is everything. And here the context is that we must find a way of bringing these parties back somehow to a negotiating table to create a peaceful outcome here.
You take us back to another memory in 2017, where you're taking a look at the relationship, if you will, between Russia and South Africa under the then President Jacob Zuma. And you speak of a form of state capture of parts of the International Relations Department then. The extent of Putin's malign reach is not yet known, but you believe in due course it will emerge here.
Well, that's right. I think it would be naive and foolish to ignore the fact that the Putin administration, the Putin regime in Moscow, has over a number of years now, more than a decade, meddled in the internal domestic political affairs of many countries. There's ample evidence from the Mueller report in relation to the 2016 Trump election and the presidential election in the United States, to the Brexit referendum the same year. But also, and you refer to that reference I make in my Mail and Guardian article, a conversation with a senior ANC politician in 2017 who said to me, I'm really concerned about party capture, the idea that Russian money was not only capturing the state in terms of that nuclear deal, which was finally stopped by the courts in South Africa, but also, no doubt, funding of the ANC and very probably individuals within the ANC, such as Jacob Zuma. We don't yet know the details of that, but I've bet my bottom dollar, as they say, on there being illicit funding from Moscow to the ANC, to senior ANC people. And that may well be an influence on certainly the ANC's position. What I hope is that it is not directly influencing South Africa's foreign policy position. And certainly in my conversations with Durban officials, and these are seasoned diplomats, expert diplomats who have been at this game for many, many years, decades even, it seems to me that their position is informed by their principles and by a long-held belief in non-partisanship, non-alignment, and not by any domestic concerns relating to ANC funding. I hope that's the case, but it remains to be seen.
Prof, a last thought from you. You also take a look at President Cyril Ramaphosa's crisis leadership. How do you characterize it?
Well, that's a good question, one I'm grappling with as I write a book on the subject. And his style is, as you know, to consult, to create processes by which he can, as he likes to put it, forge consensus on the difficult issues of the day. And he's doing that across a huge front of domestic crisis, economic, social, political, and indeed fiscal. I think he's making considerable progress. Of course, a lot of people disagree with that. They feel that his leadership is indecisive, it's not bold enough, the tempo is not fast enough for the crisis we face. But he is edging closer, and I believe in the State of the Nation address recently, we saw a step change in his mood, in his attitude to confronting that crisis. I saw greater boldness, frustration, anger even, and I think a greater willingness to take risks in terms of how to respond politically and governmentally to the various crises that South Africa faces.
As this conversation rages on for days, no doubt months to come, what is it you say? Foreign relations? In foreign relations, there are no friends, only interests. A very fascinating article you've penned. Thank you very much to Professor Richard Calland, Associate Professor in Public Law at the Department of at the University of Cape Town. You can find that article in the Mail and Guardian. It's online too.